Thank you, everybody, for coming to the Aaron Torres Podcast YouTube page. I do have one quick favor before we get to the video that you came here for, and that is very simply this. You see that little red subscribe button below this video? Go ahead, smash that subscribe button. It really does help me. It really does help this channel grow and my audience grow. So go ahead and hit that red subscribe button. And now, here is the video that you came here for. You know who's not very tough? The Michigan Wolverines, man. Listen, I swear, guys, I apologize. I know every week I say I'm not going to talk about them again next week. And then every week it is a new low. And I will say credit to you guys, because if you've listened to this show, I think I kind of prepped you for what was going to happen on Saturday night, right? And I get it, right? A lot of people, whether you're just a fan, whether other media members, maybe you're covering a team, maybe you go to your team's games, you don't have time to sit in front of a TV and watch games all day like I do. That's why I do this podcast. That's my job, right? Sit in front of the TV, watch, react. And I was very praising of Michigan after the win against Minnesota. As it turns out, Minnesota isn't very good. I think you started to see the warts and the problems in the Michigan State game. And then I told you this last week. I said after the Indiana game, I said it's done. I said they're not good. They're not an elite team. And I don't know what Michigan does at an elite level in college football right now. Quarterback is not very accurate, as you saw Saturday against Wisconsin when he threw it to the other team with nobody within 20 yards. Offensive line cannot block. They're about as bad as I have ever seen them in terms of blocking, certainly at least under Jim Harbaugh. Receivers can't catch. Defensive line's getting blown off the ball. The corners and safeties, who have usually been really good in coverage, can't guard anybody in coverage. And they basically got one guy on defense who makes all the plays, name's Dax Hill. And so I told you after the Indiana game, I said, this is going the wrong way in a hurry. And everybody said, oh, whatever. And I don't know if it's just because there was a million other games going on. People aren't really paying attention. But it felt like Saturday was the day where everybody realized, wow, this thing has gotten way worse, way faster than I could have ever imagined. And you saw people that don't normally commentate on Jim Harbaugh just saying, it's over, man. It is really definitively 100% over. And where do we go from here? And look, I've done the where do we go from here conversation. I'm not going to get into it. But when you watch a Wisconsin team that had 2 weeks off from contact practices physically dominate Michigan, you just realize that this thing is going off the rails faster than you ever could have imagined. And this is where we are. This is where we are, where I talked about last week, where Jim Harbaugh has 1 year left on his contract. You can't extend him long term. But you can't bring him back on a 1 year contract because you're not going to be able to recruit this year or next year knowing that he's a lame duck. And so it feels like it's inevitable that he's going to be leaving. I think Michigan fans listening are like, he better be leaving. Feels like it's inevitable that he's going to be leaving. But I do think there's just it's almost like I'm going to give the Jim Harbaugh obituary right now because it's inevitable. And I've talked about what's wrong, why it's wrong, how it's wrong, what's going to happen next. But today just feels like a day of mourning. There is not a single person on the planet, including Jim Harbaugh himself, that could say this thing is going in the right way, this thing is going to get fixed. And so to me, the question becomes, how did it get so bad so fast? And I do think it is a very fascinating question, right? And I do think in a lot of ways it's sad, because think about it from the most basic level. This is a guy who 6 years ago got his dream job, alma mater, returns to Michigan. His father was an assistant coach there. His dad now lives right next door to him, raising his own kids in the community. Gonna raise them back. Gonna bring them back to that national championship level. Dream job. And I know that he's done some things that rub people the wrong way, and he's been a little too brash and outspoken. But at the end of the day, imagine getting your dream job. Imagine getting the team that you're coaching to the brink of what you thought you would, and he did get them there, which we'll get into in a minute, and then it completely crashing and burning, and you realizing that you are not who you thought you were as a coach, and you are not going to get your school to the place that you thought you would be able to, and that your dream job has now turned into a nightmare. And to Jim Harbaugh's credit, as I always say, he was really close to getting Michigan to that upper level. Year 2, I always say it, bad spot at Ohio State. They could have won the game in regulation. If they win that game, They go to the Big Ten championship. They probably make the college football playoff. And Jim Harbaugh forever at least has that one win against Ohio State. He probably has a playoff berth. And as bad as it is now, he can always hold on to that forever and say, look, I kind of did what I was brought here to do. I beat Ohio State, all that stuff. Instead, it's not going to happen. And I do just think about it from the broader perspective of, like I said a minute ago, how did it get so bad so fast? Because when you think about it at its most basic level, it is really kind of incredible, right? I mean, like, there's a for all the criticism that Jim Harbaugh gets, like, there was a reason that everybody thought that this was a home run hire, that it was going to work, and that he was going to elevate Michigan. And those reasons are what you know. But when you still think about it, it's kind of crazy, right? This guy won at every level of football that you can possibly win at. Great player in college, great player in the NFL. As a head coach, won at the D2 level, won at Stanford. It's easy to look at Stanford now and say, well, a lot of people could win Stanford. No, they couldn't. Go back to look at what Stanford was up until he got that job in the early 2000s. They were one of the worst Power 5 football teams in America. They were basically the equivalent of what Vanderbilt is right now. So take what Vanderbilt is right now, bring in Jim Harbaugh, and within a couple of years, he has them in the Orange Bowl. He has them at 10, 11 wins. And he, of course, goes off to the NFL where, again, he's a player or two from winning the Super Bowl. And so I think when you think about it from that level, it really is kind of crazy, right? This guy won at D2. He won at one of the toughest jobs in college football. He won in the NFL. Michigan was the one place where it shouldn't have even been a debate. Because you look at Michigan, you look how they're set up, you look at how good the school is, you look at the resources, you look at the history. Outside of Ohio State and Penn State, I mean, you're lined up to win 10 games every year without even blinking. And that's certainly what he did, and that's certainly what happened early, but it hasn't been sustainable. And so as I said a minute ago, one thing I always try to do on this show, I always try to talk about the why. I always try to break down, okay, here's the problem, this is why it happened, or here's the problem, here's the solution, or this is a good thing, and this is why it's good, and this is how it happened. And with Harbaugh, I don't think there's an easy answer as to why this thing has fallen so far so fast. And I think if you ask people across college football, they can't tell you how it's fallen so far so fast. I mean, never forget, 2 years ago, not last season, but the season before, Michigan was 10-1 going into the Ohio State game. It was Urban Meyer's last regular season game at Ohio State. He, of course, won the Big Ten and went to the Rose Bowl. But Michigan was 10-1 going into that game. Like, it's not as though he went from 10 wins to 7 to 5 to 3. 18 months ago, like 24 months ago, 10-1 going into that Ohio State game. And so when you think about what went wrong, I really only have one real thought on that, and that's this. I do wonder if Michigan's obsession, and for Michigan fans listening, I'm not saying obsession in a bad way. You have every right to expect to beat Ohio State, expect to compete with Ohio State, right? Like, that's what Michigan football is on earth to do. That's why you pay Jim Harbaugh $8 million a year, to compete with Ohio State. So I'm not saying I'm not being critical for wanting this internal desire to beat Ohio State. But what I will say is this. What I will say is I do wonder if their obsession with beating Ohio State has now cost them against everybody else. And what I mean by that is this. I want to go through kind of the history of the Jim Harbaugh era. And I've mentioned it a few times the last few weeks. But first year, 10-3, loses to Ohio State. Second year, 10-3, loses to Ohio State. They were 10-1 coming into that game. That was the game where there was a bad spot. They win that game. They go to the Big Ten championship game. Year 3, they lose a bunch of guys. They go 8-5. And then year 4 was the one I just mentioned. 10-3. But going into that Ohio State game, they were 10-1. They lose to Ohio State. They then lose to Florida in the Peach Bowl. But before that game, before the Ohio State game, which was Urban Meyer's last game, when they went in 10-1, Michigan was kind of what they were, right? Old school Big Ten, smash mouth, 3 yards in a cloud of dust. They played that old school Big Ten boring style. But what happened was, after they lost to Ohio State, that year, in year 4 of the Harbaugh era, this is now year 6, in year 4, the powers that be at Michigan, whether it be the AD, whether it be the boosters, whoever, they basically said, look, We can't be running this archaic offense. We will never beat Ohio State. We will never compete at the highest level. Well, one, I disagree. Maybe you'll never beat Ohio State, but you were competing at the highest level. You were in the top 10. You were as good as any program in the country, not named Ohio State, Clemson, or Alabama. And I know it's easy now with revisionist history to say, oh, well, Wisconsin has been better since Jim Harbaugh got there, and Penn State has been better since Jim Harbaugh got there. And maybe that's true and maybe it isn't. But what I can tell you is this. How about this? Year 4, Jim Harbaugh at Michigan, okay? As I said, they went 10-3, 10-1 going into the Big Ten championship game. That year, they played Penn State. They beat Penn State 42-7. They played Wisconsin. They beat Wisconsin 38-13. So don't tell me that the whole time Michigan's been a middle-of-the-pack team, because as recently as 2 years ago, they were not. But after they lost to Ohio State, basically Jim Harbaugh was told, dude, you can't be running this ancient, archaic, old-school, 3 yards in a cloud of dust BS offense. Go get modern, do this RPO stuff that everybody's doing. Even Nick Saban's on board. It's what Urban Meyer's doing. It's what Oklahoma's doing. It's what all these schools are doing. We need you to be more modern on offense. And Jim Harbaugh famously went out, and he got the coordinator that he has now named Josh Gaddis. And when I say famously, it was because I don't know that Jim Harbaugh ever wanted to hire him. And maybe that's wrong. Maybe that's not fair. But, I mean, if you go back and look at it, like the story is that he never even interviewed Josh Gaddis. He called him up on the phone and offered him the job, sight unseen, interview unseen, all that stuff. And so as I look back, I do wonder, did Harbaugh really want to commit to this? Or was he forced to do it? And because he was forced to do it, this team has never been the same. Never forget, again, 2 years ago, 10-3. Last year they go 9-4, but they get smoked by Wisconsin. And for the first half of the season, the offense really struggled. Barely beat Iowa, barely beat Army, get hot at the end of the year, get smoked by Ohio State, get smoked by Alabama, which leads us into this year where they can't beat anybody. And it feels like in the process of trying so hard to modernize their offense, they just don't have an identity anymore, right? Like the old identity, as I've said a few times the last few weeks, at the very least, at least they were dominant up front. Dominant in the trenches. Maybe it was boring. Maybe it was old school. Maybe they didn't have a quarterback like Kyle Trask or Mac Jones or Trevor Lawrence or Justin Fields. But at least they did one thing well. At least they ran the ball well. At least they played great defense. Now, they're trying to do this modern stuff, but they don't really believe in it, and part of it's maybe Jim Harbaugh, and maybe he doesn't trust the coordinator. But whatever the case, they don't know what they're doing on offense. The O-line can't block. The receivers aren't comfortable. The running backs aren't comfortable. The quarterback's not comfortable. And then defensively, they've just fallen apart like a house of cards. And again, to be abundantly clear, I'm not saying that none of this is on Jim Harbaugh, right? Every other coach that's been successful has evolved. Nick Saban famously handed Lane Kiffin the keys to the offense. He said, I trust you to figure this thing out. And it worked. Ed Orgeron, Joe Brady, here's the keys to the offense. Make this thing work. It did. LSU won a national championship. Jim Harbaugh did that with Josh Gaddis. Who knows if he really trusts him? Who knows if it's because Jim Harbaugh refuses to evolve? But the bottom line remains this, is that, look, there's no returning at this point, but up until 2 or 3 weeks ago, the old argument could be, well, at least they beat the bad teams. And I do wonder if they had just stuck with what they were doing. Maybe I'm wrong. And there's going to be Michigan fans that get mad at me and comment and tweet at me and all this stuff. Well, you don't know what you're talking about. I'm just saying. I do wonder if, had Jim Harbaugh just stuck with what he was doing, be stubborn, stick with what you're comfortable with, if they at the very least could have remained on that 9-10 win trajectory, not beat Ohio State, but at least dominate everybody else and continue to win. Because you look at what Wisconsin did on Saturday night, and I just think Wisconsin, they're not as athletically gifted. The recruiting rankings aren't as good, but they know who they are. They recruit to a system. They do what they do well. They don't try to be outside of what they're capable of doing. That looked like the football team with the $8 million coach. Not Michigan, but I do feel bad for Harbaugh. I know most people don't, but it's like, to me, I just sit there and say, dude, you got your dream job, and you're crashing and burning in front of the world, and I do feel bad for the guy. All right, before I get out of here, last little topic.